When we look out at the world, at the headlines talking about, say, trade negotiations between major powers or international disputes over critical resources, maybe even global economic downturns that send shockwaves everywhere,
Mm.
the explanations we often hear tend to fall into very familiar buckets, don't they?
They really do. It's typically framed as, well, states acting purely in their own hard-nosed national interest, vying for power, security, that kind of thing.
Right, which sounds a lot like the realist perspective in international relations. That's one big explanation.
Or, on the other hand, maybe it's presented as countries trying to work together, building international laws, norms, organizations to manage shared problems, maybe promote mutual gain.
Which leans heavily towards the liberal framework, cooperation institutions.
Exactly. But what if those are just, well, the most visible layers? What if there's a different, maybe deeper structural force at play?
Like something underneath all that state action.
Sort of. A perspective that sees the entire global stage not primarily through the actions of states or institutions, but through the lens of economic power and maybe the inherent conflict rooted in different economic classes.
That's a fundamentally different starting point, isn't it?
It really is. What's fascinating here is that this perspective fundamentally shifts where you even begin your analysis.
Mm.
It argues that the familiar interactions and conflicts between states we see on the surface, well, they aren't necessarily the fundamental drivers of global events.
So there's symptoms, maybe, or
Well,
consequences?
often, yes. Symptoms are consequences of deeper economic forces, structural inequalities, and the dynamics of capitalism that shape, well, pretty much everything, from a country's foreign policy decisions to the outbreak of international conflicts or, economic crises,
So it compels us to look beneath the actions of governments, corporations.
and ask more fundamental questions like, who holds the economic power here? What class interests are actually being served or advanced by these global dynamics?
Right. And how does the basic pursuit of profit influence state behavior and international relations?
That's the core question.
Exactly. It's a powerful, maybe provocative, alternative way to frame our understanding of the world. And that's why we're doing a deep dive today into a perspective that, often gets invoked in discussions about global inequality or economic systems, but perhaps isn't always fully unpacked in its application to international affairs, the Marxist theory of international relations.
Hmm.
We've got a source here, an excerpt actually, that provides a concise yet really insightful overview. It lays out the core tenets and traces the lineage from Karl Marx himself through key thinkers who adapted his ideas for the international stage.
Yeah, and our mission with this deep dive is really to unpack this analytical framework
Mhm.
just based on what's in the source material.
Yeah.
We want to understand its foundational ideas, trace them back to Karl Marx and his understanding of society and history, and then see how later thinkers specifically adapted those ideas to explain dynamics at the international level. This perspective provides a distinct way to analyze real-world events, arguing it offers insights that other theories might miss. And our source specifically uses examples like economic crises to illustrate its explanatory power.
Right. And we want to be really clear up front, as is always the case with the deep dive. Our goal here is strictly to understand the perspective and the arguments presented in the source material.
Purely descriptive.
Exactly. We are exploring its claims, its historical analysis, its critiques of the global system, but we are strictly sticking to what the source provides. We're not endorsing any particular political viewpoint or ideology here.
Nope.
Dive is all about gaining a robust understanding of a significant critical analytical framework used to study international relations.
And it really does set itself apart. While traditional IR theories like realism focus on state power, national security, the sort of anarchic nature of the international system,
Right, the usual suspects.
and liberalism emphasizes cooperation, institutions, mutual gain through trade, and democracy. Marxist IR puts the study of class structures, economic power dynamics, and the inherent tensions within capitalism right at the very center of its analysis.
So it's a fundamental shift in focus.
A fundamental shift. It suggests that global events aren't just driven by state-to-state interactions, but by these deeper, often less visible forces tied to how economic life is organized and, well, the pursuit of profit. It's a fundamental shift in where you begin your inquiry into global affairs.
Okay, so let's unpack this foundational layer then. To really grasp how Marxist theory applies to international relations, we absolutely have to go back to the source himself, right? Karl Marx. Our source emphasizes his fundamental belief that to understand the social world, how societies function, how they change, and by extension the international one, we have to study it as a totality.
Yes, the idea of totality is absolutely crucial to Marx's method. He believes you couldn't get a complete or accurate understanding of society by looking at different aspects in isolation. You just can't.
You can't separate them out.
Right. You can't just study history over here and economics over there and politics separately. They're all deeply interconnected, constantly influencing and shaping each other in really complex ways.
So you need to study them together.
Together, as an integrated whole, to grasp the full picture of how a society operates and evolves. It's a holistic approach, fundamentally arguing that the economic structure is kind of the base upon which other social and political structures are built and influenced.
And within this totality, this interconnected whole, what did Marx see as the primary engine? What drives historical change within a nation or society?
Well, Marx argued that the primary driver of historical change was rooted in a society's economic development. Specifically, he focused on changes in the means of production.
The means of production, like how things are made.
Exactly, how things are made, the technology, the tools, the organization of work. As economies develop, these means of production change, think shifting from agrarian methods to industrial ones, or later maybe to information technology.
And as those methods change, what happens then?
Well, as those methods evolve and become more advanced or organized differently, the old social and economic structures, the old relationships people have in producing goods,
Yeah.
they often become outdated or incompatible with the new productive forces.
Ah, okay. So it creates friction.
It creates tension, pressure within society, ultimately leading to social and political change. But the really core driver of history, the source of inherent conflict and transformation, according to Marx, is the concept of class struggle.
Class struggle, that's the big one.
That's the big one. He saw history as fundamentally characterized by the tension, the conflict, and the power imbalance between different economic classes.
And in capitalist society, he identified two main classes, right?
Precisely. In capitalist societies, Marx focused on the central tension between the capitalist class, you might call them the bourgeoisie,
Right.
those who own the factors of production, the capital, the factories, the land, the machinery, and the labor class, the proletariat, the workers who own only their ability to labor and must sell that labor power to the capitalists just to survive.
So the conflict stems from this fundamental division, this power dynamic between those who own the stuff needed to make things and those who actually do the work.
That's the core antagonism, yeah. And this leads us to two absolutely key concepts from Marx's foundational economic works, like Das Kapital, or earlier essays like Wage, Labor, and Capital, which our source mentions.
Okay, what are they?
These are the factors of production and the relations of production.
Okay, let's break those down a bit more. Factors of production.
Yeah.
You said the stuff needed to make things.
Yes, these are the fundamental inputs, the means by which goods and services are produced in an economy. While the source doesn't explicitly list examples based on Marx's work, this concept covers things like land, raw materials, the tools and machinery used in production capital goods.
Factories, infrastructure.
Exactly. They are the physical and material means necessary for the production process. Think of, say, a shoe factory. The building itself, the leather, the sewing machine, the power supply, those are all factors of production.
Got it, the physical means. And then relations of production. That sounds more about the human side, the interaction around those means.
Exactly right. The relations of production are the social relationships that people enter into, specifically when they are engaged in production. In a capitalist system, as Marx analyzed it, this relationship is defined primarily by who owns the factors of production and who provides the labor to operate them.
So the relationship between the factory owner and the workers on the line.
Precisely. The owner who owns the machines and the building, and the workers who own only their labor power. It covers things like the division of labor, property relations, who owns what, and the power dynamics that arise from these economic roles. The relations of production essentially describe the structure of economic power and hierarchy within a society.
And the constant interaction, and often you said tension or conflict, between these two things, the evolving factors of production, the technology, the tools, and the established relations of production, who owns them, who works, that's what produces and determines the history of society, according to Marx.
That's the central argument, yeah. As the means of production change, say, you invent new machinery. The old relations of production, like the feudal lord-serf relationship, for instance, might become a fetter, a barrier holding back further development.
Okay.
This creates pressure for the relations of production to change, often through social upheaval or revolution, ultimately leading to a new social structure, a new stage of history. That constant dynamic tension, the potential conflict arising from these fundamental economic relationships, is what Marx saw as the driving force behind societal change and development throughout history.
What's fascinating here is how this idea of the economy being so absolutely central, the base structuring everything else, it contrasts so sharply with the traditional view in international relations, especially for a long time after the World War.
Oh, absolutely.
The main focus then was explicitly on preventing another devastating interstate conflict, right? Maintaining peace, managing the balance of power. Economy seemed almost like, well, a distraction, a secondary issue compared to the high politics of war and security.
It really was relegated to a surprisingly minor position in mainstream IR theory for decades. Our source includes this great anecdote about Charles de Gaulle, the French statesman,
Oh, yeah.
who apparently stated that real statesmen should focus on the grand issues like war and peace, explicitly leaving the economy to lesser minds.
Wow. Lesser minds. That says a lot.
Doesn't it?
Yeah.
That single quote vividly highlights how the conventional wisdom in the mid-20th century viewed the role of economics in global affairs. May be important for domestic well-being, sure, but not a primary driver or even a major factor in understanding the fundamental dynamics between states on the world stage. Security and power politics were seen as the core domain.
That perspective seems almost quaint now, doesn't it? Things have definitely changed. But our source also points out that this started to shift. The importance of the economy and IR increased significantly over time, though it took major global events to really force the change, culminating particularly after the end of the Cold War and the acceleration of globalization.
Yes, and it wasn't just a sudden flip overnight. The source traces the origins of this shift back even earlier, to the 1970s. It points to specific major events that demonstrated the vulnerability and centrality of economic factors in international power dynamics.
Like what?
For instance, the prolonged and very costly U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. That placed an enormous drain on American resources, highlighting the economic limits of military power.
Right. You can't fight forever without the funds.
And then you had the 1973 oil crises, orchestrated by OPEC. That revealed how dependent developed economies were on external resources and how economic factors could be used as potent political weapons, making the U.S. economy suddenly seem vulnerable in entirely new ways. And also, think about the financial stress and economic stagnation faced by the Soviet Union under Gorbachev in the late 1980s. Those were significant factors leading up to the Cold War's end.
So these weren't just economic footnotes in the history books. They were critical turning points. They showed how deeply intertwined economics and high politics actually were.
Exactly. These events made it increasingly impossible for scholars and policymakers to just ignore the fundamental economic dimension of international relations. And then, with a subsequent period of, U.S. supremacy after the Cold War and the dramatic acceleration of economic globalization,
Yeah, things really took off then.
interconnected financial markets, global supply chains, the rise of multinational corporations. The economy was firmly established not just as a factor, but as a core domain requiring in-depth study within international relations. The sheer scale and speed of global economic interconnectedness became too prominent and, frankly, too impactful on states and societies to be left to lesser minds.
Okay, so before Marxist IR fully takes shape as its own distinct theoretical framework, our source touches on a couple of earlier, influential economic perspectives that were important in shaping how people thought about economy and politics on a global scale. They provide a useful contrast, actually. The first one it brings up is mercantilism.
Mercantilism. Yeah, this is an ideology that emerged with the rise of the modern state in Europe, roughly in the 16th and 17th centuries. And its core principle is quite distinct from modern economic thought.
How so?
It explicitly advocated that politics should actively use economics as a tool specifically for acquiring state power. Economic strength wasn't seen as an end in itself or just about individual wealth. It was a direct means to enhance the power and security of the state relative to other states.
So the state's primary goal was to aggressively build economic wealth for the purpose of increasing state power.
Precisely, and this led to a very particular view of the world. Mercantilists saw the international arena as inherently conflictual. They believed states had fundamentally opposing national interests, and they saw really no basis for genuine, lasting cooperation or mutual gain between them. It was a competitive struggle for wealth and power. pure and simple.
Which leads directly to that classic mercantilist idea. The economy, particularly international trade, is a zero-sum game.
Exactly. That was a core tenet. The economic gain of one state, whether in trade or resource acquisition, was seen as necessarily coming at the expense of another state's loss. There wasn't really a concept of expanding the overall global economic pie. It was all about carving up a fixed or maybe slowly growing one.
And that means you had to be careful about others getting richer.
Absolutely. The mercantilist perspective instilled a deep caution. Be wary of another state's economic gain, because that gain wasn't just about wealth. It translated directly into enhanced political and, crucially, military strength.
And that stronger military power could then be used for conquest or colonization, which would further increase economic power through acquiring resources and markets, creating a kind of perpetual cycle of competition.
That's precisely the cycle they envisioned and sought to navigate. Therefore, they believed robust governmental regulation of a state's economy, finances, and trade was absolutely necessary. The state needed to intervene, maximize exports, minimize imports, especially of finished goods, acquire bullion, protect domestic industries,
All aimed at state power.
all with the ultimate aim of augmenting state power and wealth simultaneously. A strong state was needed to build a strong economy, and a strong economy enabled a stronger state. It was seen as symbiotic.
Our source shows that this idea of how a state builds that wealth actually evolved over time, reflecting different eras of economic activity.
It did. In the earliest phase, say 16th century Spain, whose power was built on getting gold and silver from its colonies, mercantilists focused intensely on accumulating bullion, actual gold and silver, as the measure and means of power.
Okay.
Later, as the Netherlands rose to prominence through its vast trading networks, the focus shifted to acquiring wealth through extensive trade and building a large trade surplus. Get more money flowing in than out.
Makes sense.
Then, with Britain's Industrial Revolution in the 18th and 19th centuries, the dominant mercantilist argument became that nations should prioritize industrialization to generate wealth and power. Making things became key.
And that focus on industrialization led directly to the idea of protectionism, right? Protecting your own industries.
Yes, precisely. Seeing Britain's success, mercantilists argued that the state should actively take measures like tariffs, subsidies, or even outright bans on imports to protect and develop its nascent or strategic local industries. This was seen as a vital state function to foster the industrial wealth necessary for national power. That emphasis on state intervention to shield domestic industry is a key legacy of mercantilism.
Okay. So mercantilism sees the economy as a state tool for power acquisition in a fundamentally conflicting world where one's gain is another's loss. Then, gradually, another perspective emerged, challenging these core tenets: economic liberalism.
Right, this presented a fundamentally contrasting view, gaining prominence from the 18th century onwards with thinkers like Adam Smith. Economic liberalism advocates for a market operating as freely as possible without significant political or state interference.
Let the market decide.
Essentially, the market, driven by individual transactions, is seen as the most efficient and effective mechanism for producing and distributing goods and services, responding to supply and demand.
This sounds like the principle of laissez-faire.
That's the term our source uses, and captures the essence. Laissez-faire, which translates roughly to let it be or let it do. It advocates for free market trade and economic activity with minimal or no government interference. From this perspective, political intervention in the market is often seen as distortive, inefficient, and ultimately retrogressive, something to be avoided because the market, left to its own devices, tends towards a natural equilibrium and efficiency.
And the key idea that makes it so different from mercantilism is that international economic interaction isn't necessarily zero-sum. It can actually benefit everyone involved.
Absolutely. This is a core difference. The liberal idea, articulated by thinkers like David Ricardo, is based on the principle of comparative advantage. No single country can produce everything most efficiently.
So specialized.
It's exactly. By specializing in what they do relatively best and engaging in free trade, countries can achieve greater efficiency and productivity. This leads to extensive economic interaction, international trade, and crucially, an overall increase in the total global wealth. It's presented as a potential win-win scenario, where all participating nations can gain simultaneously a direct repudiation of the mercantilist zero-sum concept.
And the focus shifts, too, away from the power of the state towards the individual.
Exactly. Economic liberalism places the individual consumer and producer at the center of economic activity. The individual, acting rationally to maximize their own interests, is seen as the fundamental unit. The theory suggests that the pursuit of individual self-interest in a free market, guided by the famous invisible hand, ultimately leads to the collective good and optimal outcomes. Early liberals were indeed strong advocates of strict, pretty much unfettered laissez-faire.
But the source notes that modern liberalism is a bit different. It's less absolute, acknowledging that markets don't always perform perfectly or lead to universally desirable outcomes on their own.
This is a crucial nuance in the modern liberal view presented in the source. While the desirability of free markets remains a core belief, it's recognized that they can sometimes experience market failures.
Market failures.
Situations where the free market mechanism fails to produce efficient or equitable outcomes for mutual gain. The source gives a specific, quite relatable example. The odd-even scheme introduced in New Delhi back in 2016 to curb pollution.
Ah, I remember that. To reduce traffic.
Right. But an unintended consequence was that private cab operators implemented significant surge pricing, huge price hikes.
Ah, yes. Because the regulation, the odd-even rule, reduced the supply of cars, but demand stayed high or even increased, driving prices way up.
Precisely. The pure market mechanism in that specific context with that external constraint resulted in what many considered a failure from a societal perspective, excessive costs for consumers, potentially limiting necessary travel.
So the market didn't fix it nicely.
Not in that case. And to rectify such failures, the source points out, political regulation was needed. The government had to step in, or threaten to step in, to address the unintended consequences of the market operating freely under those conditions.
So the modern liberal view, as presented here, accepts the fundamental principles of free markets and specialization for creating wealth, but also recognizes and accepts the need for a certain amount of state regulation and intervention to correct market failures, manage externalities, ensure social stability.
Exactly. It's a much more pragmatic position compared to the strict laissez-faire of earlier times. It acknowledges the complex interaction between state and market, that sometimes you need rules.
That distinction is key, shows how the theory evolved.
Based on real-world experience. Yeah.
Okay, let's circle back now and connect these earlier economic ideas, mercantilism and liberalism, to the basic tenets of Marxism as applied to international relations, as presented in our source. We've discussed Marx's foundational ideas about totality, class struggle, and the factors relations of production driving historical change. What else is fundamental to the Marxist economic view that's relevant here?
Well, what's fundamentally different about the Marxist view, compared to both mercantilism, which sees economy as a tool for state power, and liberalism, which sees the market as a source of potential universal gain, is its starting point. Marxism sees the economy fundamentally as a place of inherent exploitation and deep class inequality.
Right, coming back to those two core classes you mentioned earlier.
Yes, absolutely central are the two core social classes within capitalism. The capitalist class, the bourgeoisie, which owns and controls the factors of production, the factories, the capital, the means of making things, and is driven relentlessly by the need for profit maximization.
And the other class.
And the labor class, the proletariat, who own only their ability to work, their labor power, and must sell it to the capitalists simply to survive.
And the exploitation mechanism you mentioned earlier, how does that work in more detail according to this view? How does the profit get made?
The source explains it like this. Labor is the source of value. The workers, using the factors of production owned by the capitalist, create goods or services that have a certain value when sold in the market.
Okay.
However, the capitalist pays the worker only a wage, and this wage is calculated to be less than the value that the worker's labor has actually added to the product during the production process.
Ah, so there's a gap.
There's a gap. The difference between the value created by labor and the wage paid to labor is the source of profit for the capitalist. And because the capitalist does not share this surplus value with the labor that created it, but rather appropriates it entirely, this process is seen as inherently exploitative. The worker is simply not paid the full value of their labor.
It is interesting, though, and you mentioned this briefly before, that Marx himself saw capitalism as a necessary and in some ways even a progressive step forward from previous systems like feudalism, even with this inherent exploitation.
He absolutely did. It's a common misconception that he just hated everything about it. The source mentions that under feudalism, the masses, the serfs, were often tied directly to the land and the lord who owned it. They had very little personal freedom or choice. Their lives and labor were dictated by the feudal structure. Sometimes they were even sold along with the land itself to a new lord.
Right, almost like property.
Exactly. Marx argued that capitalism, paradoxically, offered labor at least some degree of freedom, the freedom to sell their labor power to whichever capitalist would hire them. It was a different form of coercion and dependence, sure, based on economic necessity rather than legal or traditional bondage, but it represented a relative improvement in terms of personal liberty compared to the rigidity of feudalism.
But ultimately, this system, despite being a step forward in some ways, contained within it fundamental contradictions that Marx predicted would lead to its downfall.
Yes, that's his famous prediction, that the inherent tensions and exploitation within capitalism would eventually lead to the growing organization and, potentially, the immiseration of the labor class, the proletariat. This class would ultimately recognize their shared interests, unite, and overthrow the capitalist class, the bourgeoisie,
And seize control.
and take control of the means of production themselves to establish a more equitable, classless society. That was the predicted trajectory.
Now, translating these foundational ideas, class struggle, exploitation, the drive for profit, how does this apply specifically to states and international relations? How do these internal economic dynamics shape a country's behavior on the global stage from a Marxist perspective?
This is where the application to IR becomes really clear. The Marxist assertion, carried into international relations, is that each state, regardless of its political system on the surface, is fundamentally driven by the interests of its ruling class.
Not the national interest for everyone.
Not in the way it's usually presented.
Mm-hmm.
In capitalist societies, the ruling class is the capitalist class. And these class interests deeply impact the state's power structure, its policies, and its behavior internationally. The state is not seen as a neutral actor representing the interests of all its citizens, but rather as an instrument that primarily serves and reproduces the dominance of the ruling economic class.
Okay, so if you see a state, let's say a major power with a dominant capitalist class, engaging in particular foreign policies, maybe intervening in another country, signing certain trade deals, maybe even going to war, you need to analyze the class interest behind those actions. It's not just national interest in the abstract.
Exactly. It's the specific economic interests of the capitalist class within that nation that you need to understand. Because the capitalist class's existence and power are based on profit maximization, and the urge to generate ever-increasing profits is, according to this view, a never-ending intrinsic drive of the system itself.
So if an action serves that purpose,
If a foreign policy action, a trade negotiation, or even a war serves that fundamental interest perhaps by opening up new markets, securing access to cheap resources or labor, or creating investment opportunities, then it becomes understandable within this Marxist framework. The source describes capitalism itself as a kind of repressive machinery.
repressive machinery.
Yeah, because its inherent, relentless urge for accumulating more profit will compel it to constantly expand. Seeking new markets, new sources of raw materials, and new opportunities for investment and exploitation in other nations, particularly where labor and resources are cheaper.
And this drive for expansion, fueled by the internal dynamics of capitalism, connects directly to major historical and modern international phenomena, like colonialism.
Absolutely. The source explicitly links this inherent drive for profit expansion to historical processes like colonialism and imperialism. It argues that the mercantilist drive for wealth and power, and the later liberal push for free trade and access to global markets were fundamentally manifestations of expanding capitalist systems, seeking new territories to exploit for resources, labor, and markets.
So they weren't just political power grabs.
They were also economic imperatives, driven by the logic of capital accumulation.
And in the 21st century, under the current phase of globalization, is it the same dynamic?
The source argues that the same fundamental drive is at play, albeit in evolved forms. Under contemporary globalization, we see this manifested prominently by transnational corporations, TNCs.
The big global companies.
Exactly. These massive entities, representing global capital, are constantly searching the world for places where labor is cheapest, regulations are weakest, and profits can be maximized. So the movement of production to what were historically called third world countries is presented not just as efficient global economics, but as capitalist expansion driven by the core requirement of capital to grow and accumulate profit, seeking out the most favorable conditions globally. Globalization, from this perspective, is largely the global expansion and deepening of capitalist relations of production.
That's a powerful and, somewhat unsettling lens through which to view globalization, not just as natural interconnectedness or mutual benefit, but as a systematic process of capitalist expansion driven by inherent needs for profit. Now, our source moves on to several key thinkers who took Marx's foundational ideas and applied them specifically to understand the complexities of the international system, adapting and extending his analysis. These are often referred to as neo-Marxists or critical theorists.
Right, let's dig into those. Let's start with Vladimir Lenin. He was one of the first to apply a specifically Marxist economic analysis to understand the phenomenon of imperialism and its connection to international conflict.
Okay, how did he see that connection playing out? What was his argument?
Well, Lenin observed the dynamics of the late 19th and early 20th centuries very closely. He looked at 18th and 19th century Britain, for example, detailing how it used its colonial empire and imperial expansion as a crucial base for its economic and political power.
Securing resources, markets.
Exactly. It secured resources, captive markets, and outlets for investment for British capital, becoming the dominant world power. But then he observed the rise of Germany after its unification. Germany rapidly industrialized and became an economic powerhouse in the late 19th and early 20th century, reaching a level of economic strength that rivaled or even surpassed Britain in certain areas.
So a new challenger emerges.
A new challenger, yeah. And as its economic power grew, its capitalist class required new outlets for investment, new markets, new sources of raw materials commensurate with its new strength. Consequently, Germany began aggressively demanding a redivision of global spheres of influence, demanding colonies and economic territories through its assertive foreign policy, its Weltpolitik, world policy.
So the economic rise of Germany naturally led it to challenge the existing imperial order that Britain and others had established.
That's precisely how Lenin explained it in his work on imperialism. He saw this demand for a redivision of the world's economic and political spheres of influence by a newly powerful, economically expanding capitalist state as a natural process. It stemmed directly from the dynamics of competitive capitalism in its advanced or imperialist stage.
So imperialism wasn't just a policy choice, it was baked into capitalism.
According to Lenin, yes. Capitalism, he argued, inevitably leads to the concentration of capital, the rise of monopolies, and the fusion of banking and industrial capital into what he called finance capital. This finance capital then seeks outlets for profitable investment abroad, leading to the export of capital and the economic division of the world among major capitalist powers.
And that leads to conflict.
Such disparities in economic power among competing capitalist states and the resulting demands for territory and influence, he argued, invariably lead to heightened tension and ultimately to conflict. He pointed directly to the growing rivalry between Britain and Germany for global dominance, a rivalry deeply rooted in their competing economic and imperial ambitions, which ultimately climaxed in the devastating conflict of World War I.
So WWI was basically an imperialist war over dividing the world.
From Lenin's perspective, yes, fundamentally, it was an imperialist war fought between major capitalist powers over the redivision of the world.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, I think, and the analysis moves beyond purely economic determinism. Lenin showed how internal economic dynamics and the competitive nature of capitalism drive international conflict. But the source then brings up Antonio Gramsci, who asked a question that seemed to challenge a core Marxist prediction.
Gramsci, yes. Italian Marxist writing in the early 20th century, actually from Mussolini's prisons, which is incredible in itself.
Yeah.
He was deeply puzzled by a particular historical outcome, which, well, Marx had predicted that social revolution would occur first, and most readily, in the most advanced industrial capitalist societies, places like Britain or Germany, where the contradictions of capitalism would be most acute and the proletariat, the working class, most developed.
Right.
Yet, revolution proved extremely difficult to achieve in industrialized Western Europe. Surprisingly, the first successful socialist revolution occurred in non-industrialized, comparatively backward Russia in 1917. Gramsci wanted to understand why. Why did the workers in places like Germany or Britain not rise up, as Marx had seemed to predict?
And his analysis of this puzzle led him to develop his crucial concept of hegemony, which he detailed in his prison notebooks. He saw power as more than just brute force, right?
Yes, this was Gramsci's key theoretical innovation. He argued that previous Marxist analysis, including perhaps Marx's intense focus on the base of economic structure, had primarily focused on power as being about coercion, the state's ability to use force, police, military to suppress dissent and maintain control.
The stick approach.
The stick approach, exactly. While coercion is certainly a component of power, Gramsci argued that in developed capitalist societies, power is maintained through a much more complex mixture of both coercion and consent.
Consent. How does the ruling class gain the consent of the very people it's exploiting, according to this theory?
That's the crucial question he tackled. He explained that in societies where the power of the ruling class, the capitalist class, is dominated by consent rather than just brute force, they control not only the economic base, but also, and crucially, The cultural, moral, and political values of society, what Marx referred to as the superstructure. They shape the dominant ideas, beliefs, and norms.
And they don't just impose these values top down, they actively disperse them throughout society, make them seem normal.
Exactly. These values are dispersed among different classes, becoming part of the common sense, the taken-for-granted reality for most people, and civil society plays an absolutely crucial role in this process.
Civil society,
Yeah.
like non-government groups.
Yeah, Gramsci saw civil society encompassing non-state institutions like churches, schools, universities, mass media, trade unions, cultural organizations, even political parties that aren't currently ruling as a key battleground for ideas. Civil society provides a platform for interaction between the dominant group and the masses, but also, importantly, it's where the dominant class can understand the thoughts, feelings, and potential grievances of the population.
Okay, so they listen, and then they use that understanding to subtly shape things, to maintain their legitimacy.
That's precisely where cultural hegemony comes in. The dominant class, through its influence over these civil society institutions, can make minor modifications or concessions to their values, ideas, or policies to make them acceptable, even seem desirable, to other classes, including elements of the working class.
So they co-opt some ideas.
They might. By presenting their class interest as the general interest, or by incorporating certain demands of subordinate groups in ways that don't fundamentally challenge the system, they gain legitimacy. They shape the dominant narrative, making the existing capitalist system and their own rule seem natural, inevitable, or even beneficial for everyone. This is cultural hegemony, the subtle, pervasive dominance of a ruling class's worldview that shapes the entire cultural and ideological landscape.
So once these values and ideas, this superstructure of beliefs and norms are accepted by the masses as just common sense, they internalize them and end up helping to maintain the status quo instead of challenging or revolting against it.
That's the outcome Gramsci analyzed. If the ruling class successfully establishes cultural hegemony, the masses effectively consent to their own domination, viewing the existing order as legitimate, or at least the only possible reality. Gramsci's key assertion was that while Marx rightly focused on the base, the socioeconomic structure and the conflict there, the superstructure, the moral, cultural, political values, the realm of ideology and consciousness cannot be ignored.
You need both.
You need both. A truly valid and complete study of power and society needs to consider both the economic base and the ideological superstructure and their complex interaction.
And challenging this deeply embedded consent-based power structure requires more than just, say, an economic strike or seizing the means of production by force. It requires a different kind of struggle.
Yes. Gramsci believed that to effectively challenge dominant political hegemony, particularly in these consent-based societies, counter-hegemonic structures need to emerge.
Counter-hegemonic structures.
Alternative institutions and movements within civil society that can develop and propagate competing ideas, values, and narratives challenging the dominant common sense. Civil society must provide the space, or maybe be wrestled to provide the space, for alternative historical blocks, alliances of different social groups, united by a shared counter-hegemonic vision to form and mobilize.
So you have to win the battle of ideas first.
Sure.
Essentially, yes. Creating what he called a war of position to undermine the dominant hegemony culturally and ideologically before any direct war of maneuver, like a physical revolution, could succeed in those kinds of societies.
Okay, that really expands the battlefield, doesn't it? From just the factory floor to the whole realm of ideas, culture, and institutions. Our source then introduces Robert Cox, who took Gramsci's ideas of hegemony and applied them to the international system itself, and also offered a critical look at how international relations theory itself is produced.
Right, Robert Cox. He's a highly influential neo-Marxist scholar in IR, and he offered a significant, really foundational criticism of existing, particularly mainstream IR theories, with his very famous and often quoted assertion, theory is always for someone and for some purpose.
Theory is always for someone and for some purpose. What exactly did he mean by that? It sounds like a direct challenge to the idea of objective neutral analysis. That's exactly it. Cox argued that theory is never neutral, timeless, or universal. It doesn't just drop from the sky as pure objective truth. Instead, he saw theory as deeply a reflection of the specific context, the time, the space, the power structures in which it's developed.
So it's biased by who creates it and when.
Essentially, yes. He argued that many IR theorists, often working within institutions supported by powerful states or interests, consciously or unconsciously end up serving the interests of those in power, those under whom they prosper, who fund their research, or whose worldview they implicitly share.
And how does this serving of interests play out in the theories themselves? What's the effect?
Well, Cox argued that these theories, rather than critically analyzing power structures, often end up reinforcing and legitimizing the existing status quo. They present the current international order, with all its inequalities and power hierarchies, as somehow natural, inevitable, or following fixed, unchangeable laws like the laws of anarchy and realism, or the supposed universal benefits of free markets and certain forms of liberalism.
Making it seem like that's just the way things are.
Exactly. By presenting these dynamics as natural or given, they discourage questioning the underlying power structures and make it seem as though fundamental transformation is impossible or undesirable. The purpose of such theory, Cox implied, is often to stabilize and perpetuate the existing order dominated by particular interests.
And Cox applied Gramsci's concept of hegemony to this global level, analyzing how a particular world order is maintained internationally.
He did, most famously in his book Production, Power, and the World Order. Cox argued that the international system isn't just a random collection of competing states, it's structured by a form of global hegemony. In the post-WWII and particularly post-Cold War era, he saw this dominated by what he referred to as the Anglo-US axis.
The Anglo-US Act.
A kind of partnership of major powers, primarily the US and UK and their close allies, that has shaped the institutions like the UN, IMF, World Bank, WTO, the norms and the economic rules of the world order, think Bretton Woods institutions, free trade regimes, etc. This world order, he argued, is fundamentally designed to serve its interests and the interests of global capital associated with it.
And similar to Gramsci's domestic analysis, Cox saw this global hegemony being maintained through a mixture of coercion and consent, not just force.
Precisely. The coercion is evident in the military power of the dominant states, their ability to intervene, and the economic power they wield through institutions like the IMF or World Bank, enforcing certain policies. But the consent is generated ideologically. It's created by making other nations, including those in the periphery or developing world, believe that the rules and norms of this world order, ideas like free trade, financial liberalization, globalization, are universally beneficial and represent the only rational or possible way to organize the global economy.
Even if, in practice, the structure of the global economy under these rules disproportionately benefits the core powers and maybe disadvantages others.
Exactly. The dominant powers promote the idea that participating in this free market global system is common sense, good for growth, good for everyone. And many nations accept this narrative, internalize it, even if the actual outcomes, the terms of trade, investment patterns, debt burdens, disadvantage them relative to the core. This acceptance, this consent to a world order that primarily benefits the dominant powers, is a form of global hegemony.
But like Marx and extending Gramsci, Cox sees this hegemonic structure as ultimately unstable, subject to challenge.
Yes, Cox asserts that because this world order serves particular interests, it inevitably creates contradictions and generates resistance. Eventually, counter-hegemonic movements will arise from those who are disadvantaged or marginalized by the system, groups, states, or alliances that challenge the common-sense notions promoted by the dominant powers, like free trade is always good for everyone, and seek a fundamental transformation of the world order.
This raises an important question. What does this global structure, this hegemonic world order that favors the core, actually look like? And that brings us to the final major neo-Marxist thinker discussed in our source, Emanuel Wallerstein, who offers a very specific model of the global capitalist system.
Emanuel Wallerstein, yes. Another highly influential scholar whose theory is based on what he calls world system analysis. He argues that the significant unit of social analysis isn't the individual nation-state, but a larger world system.
A world system.
A unified area where political and economic processes interact and structure relationships across different regions. It's a whole system you need to look at.
And he distinguishes two main types of these world systems throughout history.
Yes. He talks about a world empire system, where a single political entity, an empire, controls the economic processes across a vast territory. Examples might include historical empires like the Roman Empire or maybe the Holy Roman Empire. In this system, economic surplus is transferred from the periphery to the core, primarily through political and military extraction taxes, tribute, plunder imposed by the central authority.
Okay, that's one type. What's the other?
Wallerstein's primary focus is on the second type, the world economic system.
And this world economic system is basically the capitalist world economy we have today.
Precisely. In this system, economies are unified through global division of labor and interconnected markets. But politics is decentralized. There is no single global state or empire controlling the entire system. Instead, multiple states exist within this single global economy. This capitalist world economy originated, according to Wallerstein, around the 16th century with the expansion of European trade and colonialism.
And within this capitalist world economic system, he sees a clear, unequal hierarchy among different regions or countries.
Yes, this is the absolute core of his model. He divides the system into three fundamental structural positions or zones: the core, the periphery, and the semi-periphery.
Okay, let's break those down. The core.
At the top are the core areas. These are characterized by diversified economies, high wages, high-skill production, mass markets for goods, strong state institutions capable of protecting their economic interests, and advanced technological production. The source also implies advanced, often capital-intensive agriculture here. Historically, this might have started with parts of Western Europe, later including the US, Japan, and other highly developed nations.
Okay, the dominant players. And at the bottom, the peripheral areas.
The peripheral areas are at the bottom of the hierarchy. They are characterized by economies focused primarily on producing basic raw materials, agricultural products like wood, sugar, cotton, grains, as the source mentions, and low-skill, low-wage manufacturing. They tend to have weak state institutions, often unable to resist economic or political pressure from core states or multinational corporations. Their role in the system is primarily to provide cheap labor, raw materials, and sometimes markets for core goods.
And the middle tier, the semi-peripheral areas, what's their role?
These are the areas in between the core and the periphery. They exhibit characteristics of both. They might have developing industrial bases, they might exploit peripheral areas themselves, but they are also often exploited by core areas. They serve crucial structural functions in the system. Well, they have contacts to both the core and periphery, often mediating between them. They also act as a buffer. Their existence provides opportunities for peripheral areas to potentially move up in the system, though it's hard, which helps diffuse revolutionary pressures that might arise if there were just a stark core-periphery divide. They also provide diversified investment opportunities for core capital when core markets are saturated or peripheral areas seem too unstable. Examples might include countries that industrialized later or have significant industrial sectors but still rely heavily on exporting raw materials or lower-wage manufacturing. Think places like Brazil, India, South Africa, maybe historically.
And how does the economic interaction between these tiers function? What maintains this hierarchy? How does the wealth flow?
The basic working model, the mechanism that maintains the hierarchy and ensures the continued dominance of the core, is what Wallerstein calls unequal exchange.
Unequal exchange.
This is the process by which surplus value is systematically transferred from the peripheral areas up to the core areas. While exchange might appear equal on the surface in terms of market prices, Wallerstein argues that the structural power imbalances between strong core states and weak peripheral states, combined with the nature of production, high skill, high wage in the core versus low skill, low wage in the periphery, mean that the periphery effectively transfers more value to the core than it receives in return.
How does that happen?
Through things like terms of trade that favor core manufactured goods over peripheral raw materials, through profit repatriation by core-based multinational corporations operating in the periphery, through debt servicing. The strong states in the core actively use their economic, political, and sometimes military power to subdue the weak states in the periphery and enforce the terms of trade and investment that facilitate this appropriation of surplus value.
That sounds like it inherently creates instability and tension within the system. People aren't going to like being on the losing end of that.
It absolutely does. The unequal exchange and exploitation generates social tension and resistance in the periphery. However, Wallerstein argues, this tension is managed and diffused, at least partly, by the existence and function of the semi-peripheral states.
The buffers.
They act as shock absorbers, or buffers, yeah. They break up the simple core-periphery antagonism, they provide intermediate destinations for migration and investment, and they offer the possibility of upward mobility, though true movement from periphery to core is historically very rare, which can prevent a unified challenge to the system.
And does Wallerstein see this capitalist world system as a permanent feature of global life? Is it here forever?
No, definitely not. Like other historical systems he studied, he believes it has a finite lifespan, a beginning, a middle, and an end phase. He argues that the capitalist world system, which originated with the geographical discoveries and global expansion of the 16th century, linking back interestingly to the origins of mercantilism as an early phase of capitalist development, entered its crisis stage after the end of the Cold War.
A crisis stage, meaning it's breaking down.
Essentially, yes.
He argues the system faces internal contradictions, like the constant need for expansion hitting ecological or social limits, and external challenges that it cannot ultimately overcome, leading to increasing instability and potential transformation into something else entirely. The inherent drive for endless capital accumulation, he suggests, ultimately undermines the very conditions necessary for that accumulation itself in the long run.
So the system itself, through its internal dynamics and inherent contradictions, contains the seeds of its own eventual decline and end. It's a very long-term structural view of capitalist history on global scale. And our source brings this kind of analysis right up to the present day, using recent global economic events as a case study to demonstrate the relevance of this Marxist perspective today.
Yes, it makes that connection very explicitly. It notes that immediately after the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a widespread belief, particularly in the West, that the Marxist paradigm for understanding society and history was essentially finished, done, over.
Right, the end of history idea was floating around. Exactly. The apparent triumph of market economies and liberal democracy seemed to invalidate Marx's predictions. This view seemed reinforced as even economies like China and Cuba began adopting more market-friendly approaches. Marxism certainly declined in mainstream academic and political discourse for a time.
But then came what the source describes as a renaissance of Marxist analysis. Why?
Exactly. The source argues we're witnessing a significant revival of interest in Marxist ideas today, specifically because of the series of major financial and economic crises that have occurred globally since the late 1990s, and especially since 2008.
Like which ones?
Events like the 1997 Asian financial crisis, the 1987 stock market crash, but particularly the massive U.S. subprime mortgage crisis that erupted in 2008, followed by the European sovereign debt crisis. These have profoundly reopened fundamental questions about the stability, the equity, and the inherent consequences of the capitalist system itself. These crises expose deep flaws and inequalities that mainstream theories seemed unable to adequately explain or predict.
And the 2008 financial crisis is presented in the source as a particularly powerful, almost textbook example of phenomena that Marxist theory helps to illuminate.
It is. The source describes the sequence quite clearly. The crisis began deep within the banking and financial system, triggered by speculative bubbles, particularly in housing, and complex, poorly understood financial instruments.
Which led to an immediate need for massive intervention to prevent a total meltdown.
Yes, states, particularly in the core capitalist countries like the US and UK, undertook massive, unprecedented bailouts of major banks and financial institutions, injecting trillions of dollars of public money to stabilize the system.
But this state intervention had a direct consequence, didn't it, for the states themselves?
A huge consequence. These states themselves became highly indebted as a result of essentially socializing the losses of the private financial sector. They took the bad debt onto the public books.
And the response to that rapid accumulation of state debt, what came next?
Precisely what the source highlights. Governments, particularly in Europe and the US, resorted to severe austerity measures.
Austerity, cutting back.
Significant cuts to public spending on social programs, healthcare, education, infrastructure, reductions in public sector jobs, ostensibly to reduce the national debt and deficits incurred by the bailouts.
And the impact of those austerity measures was borne disproportionately by the public, not the banks that caused the crisis.
Exactly. The source points out that the direct result of these austerity policies was often a significant rise in unemployment, increased poverty, reduced access to public services, and a widening of social inequality. This, in turn, threatened to destabilize the political system itself as populations grew increasingly angry and disillusioned with the response to the crisis.
There's a quote the source uses from the geographer and prominent Marxist thinker David Harvey that really seems to encapsulate the Marxist critique of this entire sequence of events. It's quite stark.
It's a very sharp summary, yeah. David Harvey's quote, as provided in the source, is, "Privatize profits, socialize risks, save banks, but put screws on the people."
Wow. Privatize profits, socialize risks. Let's unpack that. That phrase really distills the core critique, doesn't it?
It really does.
The financial sector and the capitalist class reaped enormous private profits during the boom years leading up to 2008, often through reckless or speculative behavior. Those gains were theirs, privatized. But when that behavior led to a crisis and potential collapse, the enormous risks and costs associated with that failure, the potential collapse of the whole financial system were transferred to the state and ultimately to the public through bailouts paid for by taxpayers and future debt.
Those risks were socialized, spread across everyone.
And then the consequence of that socialized debt austerity led to cutbacks and hardship, putting the screws on the people, particularly the labor class and vulnerable populations, while the very banks that arguably caused the crisis were saved.
It's presented as a clear illustration, from this perspective, of the state acting not as a neutral arbiter or representative of the whole society, but intervening decisively to protect the interests of capital and the financial system, while the broader public bears the direct costs and consequences through lost jobs, reduced services, and increased inequality.
And the source points specifically to the Occupy movement in the U.S. in 2011 as a direct manifestation of the social tension and anger generated by this process, analyzed through a Marxist lens.
Yes, the Occupy movement saw protesters taking to the streets and public spaces across the U.S., explicitly highlighting the vast social disparity and economic inequality that seems so starkly visible after the crisis and the subsequent bailouts.
And their slogan captured it all.
Their overarching slogan, "We are the 99%, directly echoes the Marxist concept of class division, identifying a tiny capitalist class, the 1%, who benefited from the system and were protected by the state, versus the vast majority, the 99%, who faced job losses, foreclosures, debt, and austerity. This movement is presented as a direct, real-world expression of the inherent social tension, class disparity, and popular discontent within the capitalist system, precisely as Marxist analysis would predict would be exacerbated and made visible by such a crisis.
So from this perspective, the 2008 crisis isn't just a technical financial event or some temporary glitch in the system. It's a concrete, recent example of the capitalist system's inherent instability, its tendency to generate crises, and its fundamental structure of exploitation and inequality, where the state ultimately serves to protect capital, even at the expense of the majority, leading to social unrest and political challenges like the Occupy movement.
Exactly. And if we connect this back to the broader framework we've been discussing, from Marx to Lenin, Gramsci, Cox, Wallerstein, it provides a powerful, albeit deeply critical lens for understanding not just this past crisis, but ongoing dynamics in the global political economy.
Like what kind of dynamics?
Well, ongoing debates about rising inequality, the immense power of multinational corporations, the role and impact of international financial institutions like the IMF and World Bank, and perhaps even the underlying sources of conflict and instability in the world today.
So what does this all mean for you, our listener, as you look at the world? Understanding this Marxist perspective, drawing on Marx's original ideas about class and economic structure driving historical change, and then seeing how thinkers like Lenin, Gramsci, Cox, and Wallerstein extended and adapted that analysis to the international system with concepts like imperialism, hegemony, world systems, unequal exchange. What's the takeaway?
Well, I think it offers a profoundly different lens through which to view global events compared to the traditional state-centric or institution-focused theories we started with. It challenges the assumption that international relations are primarily driven by states pursuing abstract national interests in a vacuum, or by institutions promoting universal benefit.
Instead, it pushes you to look deeper.
Instead, it pushes you to consistently look at the underlying economic structures, the dynamics of capital accumulation, and the role of class interests. To ask, who really has economic power? How does that power shape state actions and global rules? And who ultimately benefits and who loses in the international system? It adds significant and, often uncomfortable layers to how we can analyze everything from international trade agreements and global supply chains to geopolitical conflicts and protest movements.
It's a critical analytical tool, then, distinct and often fundamentally questioning of the status quo explanations we usually encounter.
Definitely a questioning perspective.
It forces you to ask deeper questions about power and inequality in the global system. And thinking about that and bringing it back to the idea Wallerstein mentioned about the capitalist world system potentially being in its final crisis phase, this raises an important question, maybe a provocative one, for you to ponder based on the material we've explored today. Given the Marxist argument that the capitalist world system is inherently prone to crisis and, according to some like Wallerstein, may have entered its terminal phase, does the analysis of events like the 2008 financial crisis and perhaps other persistent economic or social tensions you observe in the world today suggest that the system is indeed approaching a fundamental structural transformation? Or are these crises simply recurrent, albeit severe setbacks within a remarkably resilient structure that will continue to adapt and perpetuate its core dynamics?
That's the multi-trillion-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. What aspects of current global events, from, say, trade wars to climate change debates to ongoing protests against inequality, might you view differently now, having considered the world through this particular critical lens? Something to think about.